Lee Van Cleef talks about the 6 famous people that died that hurt him the most. Clarence Leroy was Lee Van Cleef's real name. Van Cleef Jr.B. On January 9, 1925, in Somerville, New Jersey, he was born into a poor family that didn't give him any hints about the famous movie presence he would one day have. Discipline and resilience were important parts of his early existence. During World War II, he served in the United States Navy. This experience gave him a stoic fortitude and emotional control that subsequently came out strongly on film. Van Cleef almost accidentally became an actor after the war. His high cheekbones, hawk-like eyes, and angular features didn't fit the model of a typical Hollywood leading man from the 1950s. Those traits didn't hold him back. They made him stronger. Hollywood rapidly realized that Van Cleef could play the role of a bad guy, a mysterious person, and a morally ambiguous person better than nearly anybody else. He mostly played bad guys and tough supporting characters in his early films. He often died in memorable ways on screen, but his moments stayed with people long after they were over. He had one of his first and most famous parts in High Noon, 1952, where he played one of the violent bandits that threatened Gary Cooper's marshal. Van Cleef's presence was electrifying, silent, attentive, and scary, even though he was only on screen for a short period. This performance set the tone for a lot of his early work. He was in a lot of westerns and crime movies in the 1950s, like Shane 1953 and The Big Combo 1955. He generally played men on the dark side of society in these movies. Gunmen, enforcers, and crooks were figures who said a lot with only a look or a cautious, careful movement. Even though he worked steadily, Van Cleef's career took a big hit in the late 1950s when he got into a bad car accident that left his knee permanently crippled. The accident made it hard for him to move about, which made Hollywood producers less likely to cast him, especially in roles that required a lot of physical work. For a while, it looked like his career may just fade away. But this time of trouble simply showed how strong Van Cleef was. He kept working when he could, showing up on TV and in less well-known projects, patiently waiting for the chance that would change his legacy. That chance arrived in the middle of the 1960s, but it wasn't in Hollywood. It was in Italy. Director Sergio Leone saw something special in Van Cleef and cast him as Colonel Douglas Mortimer in For a Few Dollars More, 1965. Mortimer was a coldly elegant bounty hunter whose intelligence and emotional depth matched his deadly competence. This part made Van Cleef go from being a well-known face to an international star. He wasn't just a bad guy or a side character anymore. As Mortimer, he was as imposing as Clint Eastwood and brought refinement, deep sadness, and moral complexity to the spaghetti western genre. Van Cleef followed this success with another famous role in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly 1966, when he played the ruthless Angel Eyes. His portrayal of pure, methodical evil is still one of the scariest villain performances in movie history. Angel Eyes weren't loud or showy. Van Cleef, on the other hand, depicted him as calm, calculating, and completely unrepentant, which made his cruelty even more unsettling. His steady look and measured delivery made simple statements sound like threats, making him one of the best bad guys in movies. Lee Van Cleef became a key figure in European westerns in the years that followed. He often starred in movies like Day of Anger 1967, The Big Gun-O 1966, and Death Rides a Horse 1967. These roles let him play more complex characters, such men who were motivated by revenge, honor, or a strict personal code instead of just being a bad guy. His power on screen rose as he got older. He looked wise, dangerous, and experienced, like the mythical Western anti-hero. As the years went by and Hollywood itself changed, Lee Van Cleef kept coming up with new ideas, refusing to slip away peacefully. In 1980, he starred in The Hard Way opposite Patrick McGoohan. It was a gritty, elegant crime thriller made by John Boorman that showed how Van Cleef could communicate fear, authority, and moral ambiguity with just a look. That year, he starred in the martial arts Smash the Octagon with Chuck Norris, which introduced him to a new generation of action enthusiasts. Van Cleef was the film's cunning and vicious villain. He showed that even in a time when younger action stars were in charge, his cold demeanor and ice charm were still unrivaled. His career kept going strong into the early 1980s, when he had a notable supporting role in John Carpenter's now famous cult masterpiece Escape from New York 1981. Van Cleef's entrance added weight and authenticity to the film's apocalyptic universe, even though he wasn't the main character. It reminded fans that he could make any picture better with his unique screen presence. But as the years went by, Van Cleef slowly faded from the Hollywood spotlight. This wasn't because his brilliance had faded, but because the industry was changing. He made a big comeback to TV in 1984 as a wise and powerful ninja master in NBC's adventure show The Master. The casting was great. Van Cleef's aged features and strong presence were suitable for the part of a mentor who was strict and mysterious. Sadly, the show was canceled after only 13 episodes, even though it had a lot of potential. This cut short what could have been a late career comeback on TV. Van Cleef kept working hard, bringing his serious tone to a number of international and action-oriented projects. He helped Lewis Collins with the military adventure codename Wild Geese 1984, and later worked with David Carradine in Armed Response 1986. Once again, he shows how flexible he is and how open he is to working with new people and genres. Van Cleef never stopped working on his trade, even as he became older. He just picked his roles very carefully, and now we have a lot of great personalities to remember. Van Cleef had an amazing career. Over the course of almost 40 years, he appeared in 90 feature films and 109 television shows. His legacy is that of a consummate professional and one of the most well-known and respected character performers in cinematic history. He has been in everything from classic westerns to modern action movies, cult television shows, and international movies. Van Cleef's life outside of acting was a lot like the characters he played in westerns and crime movies, rough, tender, and quietly strong. Before his angular face and steely gaze became famous for being scary on screen, he was already a well-known actor. He was a family man who cared about them and was striving to make a living amid tough times. He married Patty Ruth Cale in 1943, and they had 3 kids together. During those years, they had to deal with the usual problems of marriage, parenting, and making ends meet. Very different from the harsh terrain and gunfights that would ultimately make up his career. The marriage ended in 1958 after 15 years, which was a very important time in his life. Van Cleef fell in love again 2 years later, in 1960, with Joan Marjorie Draw. Their connection grew during a time when his profession was changing, which brought him both chances and stress. The marriage lasted more than 10 years, but it ended in divorce in 1974. This shows how hard it can be to match the pressures of Hollywood with personal stability. Van Cleef kept going even though he was disappointed. The emotional toll of his voyage had changed him, but it hadn't broken him. He married Barbara Havilone in 1976, and she would be with him for the remainder of his life. In his later years, their marriage gave him a sense of stability and friendship, which helped him feel better as he thought about a career that had finally won him fame and respect. Barbara was with him till he died in 1989, and she was a silent proof of the strong tie they had. Van Cleef played a lot of men who seemed emotionally closed off over his career, silent gunmen, heartless bad guys, and tough survivors of a harsh frontier. But beneath the high cheekbones and steely stare was a man who was very perceptive and sensitive and paid close attention to the people around him. Van Cleef talked frankly about the losses that influenced him in rare times of reflection late in his life. He named 6 famous deaths that hit him hard and left emotional scars that would endure a long time. Gary Cooper. Van Cleef once claimed that Gary Cooper was one of the first persons who made her believe you didn't have to yell to get a screen. Cooper's death in 1961 had a big impact on him, both as a fan and as an actor learning to control himself in an industry that often rewarded too much. Van Cleef liked how Cooper had a quiet authority and could express moral weight with few words. He thought that Hollywood lost its backbone when Gary died. He stood for an old way of life that included respect, honesty, and honor. I tried to bring some of that with me to every job I had after that. Robert Ryan. Van Cleef was profoundly hurt by Robert Ryan's death in 1973 since it hit so close to home. Bob said he understood darkness, but not the comic sort. He meant the actual kind that lives inside individuals. Like Van Cleef, Ryan often played characters that were morally ambiguous or had conflicting feelings. Van Cleef felt a connection to him both at work and in his personal life. When he died, I realized that there weren't many performers left who weren't scared to appear bad on screen. Bob didn't go after responsibility. He looked for the truth. Wayne John. Van Cleef's era came to an end when John Wayne died in 1979. even though their styles were very different. He said that you didn't have to like Duke to miss him. The West really changed for good after John Wayne died. Van Cleef thought Wayne was a huge emblem of vintage American movies. He was bigger than the parts he played. The West felt emptier, less magical, and more thoughtful after he left. It made me realize that we were all becoming part of history. Richard Boone. Van Cleef felt Richard Boone's death in 1981 on a more intimate level. He remembered that Richard had fire. He was quite ardent, had strong opinions, and was not afraid of anything. He was really pleased by Boone's intelligence and how seriously he took his work. He had respect for the crowd. He thought that acting was important. It seemed like losing one of the last men who really fought the system instead of giving into it. Henry Fonda. Van Cleef felt a deep feeling of finality when Henry Fonda died. In 1982, he said quietly that Henry stood for decency. There was a conscience in him even when he played bad guys. Van Cleef liked how long Fonda lived and how clear his morals were. I felt like the curtain was closing on the golden age when he died. These people were not just actors. They were like anchors. They kept the industry stable. Sergio Leone. The death of director Sergio Leone in 1989 was probably the hardest to deal with. Sergio didn't simply offer me parts. He gave me a new life. Van Cleef stated, Leone casting him in for a few dollars more brought his career back to life. I felt like I lost the man who really noticed me when Sergio died. Leone's operatic vision and faith in Van Cleef altered his life. The world would never have known the version of myself that mattered most without him. Lee Van Cleef showed a part of himself that people don't often see as he thought about these losses. A man who has been formed by both success and failure. He said that every death took away a piece of the world I knew, and each one reminded me that we're only passing through, leaving behind shadows on a screen. Lee Van Cleef refused to give up on time or disease, even though he had been sick for years, and would have given up on most men. From the 1970s on, he fought heart disease, which was a quiet enemy that followed him for the rest of his life. The placement of a pacemaker in the 1980s was a clear sign of how weak his body had become, but it never made him less determined. Van Cleef kept working hard even as his health got worse. He was driven by the same discipline and determination that had distinguished both his on-screen and off-screen demeanor. He worked as an actor till the end, showing that his love for movies was stronger than pain, fear, or physical limits. That unyielding will ultimately hit its limit on December 16, 1989. Van Cleef fell down in his Oxnard, California, house after having a heart attack that killed him. Heart failure was the main cause, however, throat cancer was also named as a contributing component. To show how many physical fights he has silently fought. His death ended a career that lasted for decades and had a lasting impact on film history, especially in the Western and action genres. His piercing eyes, sharp features, and strong presence made him distinctive. Lee Van Cleef's legacy was clear, in death as it was in life. He was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery in the Hollywood Hills, a spot where famous movie stars are buried. Their work helped build the mythos of American cinema. The words "best of the bad" are carved into his tombstone marker. This is a wonderful epitaph that properly depicts how people will remember him. This is an homage not only to his famous roles as villains, anti-heroes, and morally ambiguous characters, but also to how well he made characters who may have been one-dimensional more interesting, smart, and charming. That inscription is a last tribute to an actor that made people love to be scared of him and scared to forget him. Lee Van Cleef played the bad guy a lot, but he did it with such style and authority that he became one of the most revered and well-known actors in genre cinema. His presence is still strong decades after his death, showing that legends do not fade, they last.